It gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce today's speaker, the Honorable Bob Rae. Not that he needs a great deal of introduction. Bob Rae is the Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre. He's currently Foreign Affairs Critic for the Liberal Party of Canada, but his career has been long and illustrious. He's served his province and this country for over 35 years, starting when he was first elected to the House of Commons in 1978. Mr. Rae became the leader of the Ontario NDP in 1982. 8 years later, in 1990, he was elected as Premier of Ontario, a role he then served for 5 years. Mr. Rae then moved into a more private sphere, all the while staying engaged in public policy debate and in public service. It was during this period that he served on the Security Intelligence Review Committee. He was also a board member of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, and he advised the Liberal government on the Air India disaster as well. Those of us involved in the world of higher education are very familiar with Bob Rae's work on post-secondary, which he did on behalf of the Government of Ontario. His final report, which was released in 2005, set higher expectations for higher education. And it has, I think it's fair to say, had a transformative impact on post-secondary education in the province of Ontario. In 2006, Mr. Rae re-entered the political arena, switched political allegiances, and entered the race for leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. He was re-elected to the House of Commons for Toronto Centre in 2008. When Michael Ignatieff resigned as Liberal leader following the 2011 federal election, the Liberal caucus chose Bob Rae to step in as interim party leader. He worked at rebuilding the Liberal Party for a period of 18 months. In fact, only stepping down 2 weeks ago to hand the reins to Justin Trudeau. Last year, Maclean's magazine recognized Bob Rae as Parliamentarian of the Year, an honor that says a great deal about his respect for public institutions and democratic processes, but also about his commanding oratory skills and his leadership abilities. An inveterate politician, Bob Rae is also a brilliant policy analyst on myriad topics, including Aboriginal affairs. As early as 1990, Bob declared his support for the inherent right of Native Canadians to self-government. Since then, he has worked with no fewer than 6 Aboriginal bands in Northern Ontario to change their futures. Today, Bob Rae will share his thoughts on the urgency of progressive change for Aboriginal peoples living within Canada's national borders, a topic on which he is both very knowledgeable and deeply passionate. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bob Rae.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Principal Wolf, for those very kind words of introduction, and I'm very, very proud to have a chance to speak to this gathering, and somewhat daunted by seeing the number of former deputy ministers and clerks of the Privy Council and parliamentary budget officers and heads of Statistics Canada, and even many public servants from Ontario who are spending this Rae Day in Kingston. I was very honored to get the invitation to come and speak to you at the end of this day, which I gather from all of the dialogue and chatter which I heard in the hall has been a very popular and successful session. And I've decided that as the principal has said that my topic is going to be one that I've taken a long interest in as a member of Parliament, as a member of the Legislature of Ontario, and I don't pretend to be a deep kind of scholarly expert, but I certainly do have experiences and views which I hope are driven by evidence and by the facts. But before I get into the sort of the gist of what I want to say, for those of you who have to leave early at any point, just so you know what the end is, I'll take no offense if you decide to leave right away after I said these few words. I understand that. I really do believe that there are in our country several pieces of unfinished business, several things that we need to continue to really work on and take as seriously as we possibly can. And I do feel that this question, the question of the relationship between Aboriginal First Nations people and the rest of us, is the largest piece of unfinished business. Unfortunately, if you take a poll and you read the Ipsos Reid polls or other polls that tell you what are the priorities of the majority of Canadians, Aboriginal issues always features at the very end of the scale, the lower end of the scale. And of course, our politicians are frequently driven by looking at those polls and saying, well, I'd better focus on these questions rather than others. 2 or 3 times in our national life, political figures have come along who've said, I don't really care what the polls say, this is what I believe in, and this is what I know in my heart has to be done. I'll have a word about that, about those opportunities. But the demographics of life and the way in which things are moving in our country tell me that this is now the critical issue in the country, and in 20 years it's going to be an even bigger and more critical issue. And if we don't get people to face up to this and wake up to the potential and the great benefits that it will bring to the country, but also the great risks that we run, if we don't take it seriously enough, we're making a huge mistake. One of the advantages of being in opposition, and having spent most of my career as an opposition politician, I've had this advantage, is it actually gives you time to read. You can even commit not only sociology, you can commit you can commit history, you can commit anthropology, you can commit political science, you can commit economics, you can commit all of these terrible affronts to human nature. You can do all of these things. And it gives you time to reflect. And I think one of the toughest things in the area of public policy is not only identifying what's on people's minds today, but what's going to be on people's minds in 5 or 10 years. And at that point, people will turn around and say, well, why didn't you do something about this? Why didn't you address this when you could have? And if you simply say to people, well, because it wasn't one of your top 5 lists, wasn't on your top 5 or 10, they'll say, well, you're supposed to be a leader. You're supposed to tell us how things are going to be. And I think that's one of the critical tests that we now have to face up to today when we look at this issue. We are, like many others, like Australia, like the United States, like New Zealand, like South Africa, like a number of countries around the world, we are an Aboriginal country as well as a settler country. That's who we are. We don't often see ourselves in this way. We don't often describe ourselves in this way. In fact, if you think about how we all, looking around the room, I think most true for most of us who grew up in the educational system in Canada, we grew up thinking of ourselves essentially as an outpost of Europe. And our ideas and our thinking and our way of looking at the country and our way of looking at the world was very much an extension of that. But I think we now realize, I hope more and more of us realize, how inadequate a description that is of what our country is and who we are and what we have become. The fact that settlers are in a significant majority doesn't take away from the simple fact that when Europeans made first contact with the northern half of North America, there were already probably millions of people here, but at least hundreds of thousands of people here. And while I'm speaking, perhaps I can give a plug for the brilliant book 1491, only to be succeeded by 1493, both of which talk about this great chasm which took place in the Americas with the arrival of European settlement. From the Beothuk and Newfoundland, a population that was completely wiped out by disease and violence, across every corner of Canada to the far west and north, Canada's first peoples had, by the time Europeans arrived, had already built a civilization, a way of life that was thousands of years old and rich in diversity. They were not savages, as they were called in French and English at the time, and unfortunately many times since, nor were they ignorant wretches, as they were described, nor were they less than people. They had developed complex societies with distinct languages, systems of governance. They were real people with a real way of life. In fact, in one of the first decisions of the American Supreme Court, one of the most important decisions of the court in its early days, Chief Justice Marshall, when he was talking about why it was that in the United States Indian nations should be considered at least semi-sovereign, he said this: America, separated from Europe by a wide ocean, was inhabited by a distinct people, divided into separate nations, independent of each other and the rest of the world, having institutions of their own and governing themselves by their own laws. It is difficult to comprehend that the discovery of either by the other should give the discoverer rights in the country discovered, which annulled the previous rights of its ancient possessors. The first centuries after first contact were marked by apocalyptic disease, so that the population, the Aboriginal First Nations population, while it was high in 1491 and close to 1 million, they would estimate in all of the area that is now Canada, very shortly after Confederation, when they started doing the national census, estimated that the Aboriginal population was probably about 100,000 across the country. So you can imagine the devastation which had taken place, the apocalyptic impact of disease, to say nothing of the institutionalized racism and the colonial duplicity that promised peace and security and delivered neither. It is not my purpose today to give a history lecture and to document these points, but enough work is being done by distinguished anthropologists and historians to justify each point. In fact, let me right now pay tribute to the tremendous scholarship that is underway, even by lawyers. Another commitment that one could make, but that is really taking place, that has begun to transform our understanding of the position of First Nations in the country historically as well as today. It is important to understand more recent history to understand what we are, where we are today in the continuing story of what's been called the encounter. Public policy has gone through many different phases and enthusiasms, and to a great extent we live today in the shadow of past decisions and past attitudes. Public policy has perhaps best been described as what happens when you're exhausted all the alternatives. And I think what we're going to explore a little bit today is some of the alternatives that have been tried and that have failed. The premise of colonial settlement, I will refrain from using the anachronistic word discovery, was that the lands of the Americas were there to be conquered and populated as a matter of right. From a legal standpoint, the lands were described as terra nullius, empty land, and therefore belonging to whichever empire could enforce their control through superior force of arms. From the earliest days, the accounts of the time tell us of the discrepancy between the narrative of the indigenous people and that of the Europeans. For indigenous people, land could not be, quote, given away or, quote, surrendered, because it was not theirs to give. It was a heritage that they shared, but it did not belong to them. A gift of the Creator could be shared, but it could never be sold. To the settler mind, these ideas were incomprehensible. Land needed to be divided, it needed to be worked, it needed to be controlled. When the British Empire took control from the French Empire in 1763, the Treaty of Paris was quickly followed by the Royal Proclamation, which is worth noting for a moment. I'm going to read out the preamble in just a moment because it's interesting to hear it. The proclamation was a document of statecraft, just as the Quebec Act of 1774 was about securing the loyalty of French Canadians in the face of trouble in the 13 colonies. The British knew perfectly well that they had to recognize the integrity of indigenous societies in order to deal with the appetite for settlement and expansion that was such a powerful feature of North American society. Indeed, there are many historians who believe that one of the real reasons for the conflict between the American colonies and the British was the British determination to limit expansion at the Appalachians. So what does the Royal Proclamation say? It says in its preamble, whereas it is just and reasonable, I love this because it's so crafty the way they've worded this. They say, whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interests and the security of our colonies, that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as not having been ceded to or purchased by us are reserved for them or any of them as their hunting grounds. So you can see right away from the wording that, yes, it was the moral thing to do. Of course, all empires do moral things, but also essential to our interests and to the security of our colonies. The British knew that they had to do this in order to deal with the appetite for settlement and expansion. But as settlers both in British North America and the U.S. were themselves granted more autonomy, the rights of First Nations were increasingly dismissed. Gone were the noble ideas of people who had a right not to be molested or disturbed, as it states in the language of the proclamation. Lands were given, perhaps the best example today, the most alive example. I know that some of my friends from Six Nations are here. The greatest example is the Haldimand Tract in Ontario. Suddenly we've all become students of the War of 1812 because under the current regime, committing history in some cases is all right. If you're celebrating the formation of the first Conservative Riding Association or something, that's okay. But suddenly the War of 1812 was assumed importance that none of us ever knew that it had in our childhood. But one of the things that's interesting as you read that history is that the British succeeded largely because they were able to make deals with a number of Aboriginal First Nations communities across southern Ontario who became the most loyal to the Crown and the most effective fighters, of whom the American troops were absolutely terrified. And as part of the deal for this was that they were given this huge tract of land, the Haldimand Tract, which stretches right through the Grand River being the common boundary of it, right the boundaries of the Grand River all the way up past Kitchener-Waterloo. And if you look at the history of the 19th century, it's fascinating how this land was literally taken away, lost, grabbed back to the point where the Brantford Reserve is now a mere smidgen of what the original tract of land was. And there is today, as people will know, there is today a claim that has been put forward that the federal government and the provincial government have been supposed to have been trying to deal with. The Caledonia incident was the direct product of the complete and utter failure of governments to recognize that this land claim is an absolute certainty of its case. And the only issue is, how do you possibly compensate people whose land was literally stolen from under them 150 years ago? What is the method of compensation that one could possibly find that would make up for the value of the land lost? And so these issues are very live. Lands were given, they were taken away, promises were made and then broken, people were moved at will. And the moving of people at will has continued almost up to the present day. It's not unusual to find that people are being told, even one of my colleagues in Ontario, Mr. Pope, was asked to do a report on the location of a reserve in northern Ontario. He suggested it should all be moved to close to Timmins. That would be a much better result. And of course, people said, we don't want to do that. That's not where we want our reserve to be. So this is an issue which didn't go away. The recent Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, I say recent because it's only 20 years old, which is still the source of much wisdom and understanding, points out that in 1857, the province of Canada passed an act to, quote, encourage the gradual civilization of the Indian tribes, quote. It provided the means for Indians of, quote, good character, as determined by a board of non-Aboriginal examiners, to be declared for all practical purposes non-Indian. As non-Indians, they were invited to join Canadian society, bringing a portion of tribal land with them. There's only one man, so far as we know, Elias Hill, who was in fact a Mohawk from Six Nations, who is known to have accepted this great invitation. When Confederation came, it was followed immediately by the passage of the Indian Act, which is still a statute on the books today. It's been changed and amended, but it's still in its structure, and I would argue that in its essential philosophy, it has not been changed since the 19th century, which was described this way by the annual report of the Department of the Interior in 1876. Our Indian legislation generally rests on the principle that the Aborigines are to be kept in a condition of tutelage and treated as wards or children of the state. It is clearly our wisdom and duty, through education and other means, to prepare him for a higher civilization by encouraging him to assume the privileges and responsibilities of full citizenship. It is actually hard for, maybe it's not hard for you, but it's certainly hard for me, I'm sure it's hard for all of us, to absorb the extent to which institutionalized racism was at the heart of public policy for so long in our own country. From the past system in the Indian Act to blatant acts of discrimination, not allowing people to vote, not allowing people to marry, not allowing people to travel, not allowing people to have the full benefits and rights of citizenship, up until modern Canadian history, not our distant colonial past, but in fact our post-colonial past. It's hard to read this and not realize the extent to which we are in fact a colonial country. Prime Minister Harper actually committed bad history when he made a statement indicating Canada's differences from the UK and from the Americans, saying that we were not a colonial country. We were not a colonial country. But in fact, we are a colonial country. And if we don't understand that about ourselves, then it isn't going to be possible for us to do what has to be done. I want to just take us briefly through the next 100 years post-Confederation and try and do it as quickly as I can. But it was all based on the premise that land was to be taken away and in fact surrendered and forced out of people's hands so that other forms of economic development could take place. So you'll remember, of course, that the next great real estate transaction in the history of the country after 1867 was the purchase of Rupert's Land. Well, it was the purchase of Alaska from the Russians by the Americans. And then in order to deal with what that appeared to do to our country, we then said, well, we've got to get a hold of the Hudson's Bay territories. So we bought the Hudson's Bay territories and declared them to be part of Canada. It was the largest real estate transaction that had ever taken place at that point in the history of the world, larger than the Louisiana Purchase. But it wasn't anybody's to sell, let alone anybody's to buy. There were people that were already living there. There were people that had lives there, from the Crees and the Blackfoot on the prairies, who spent thousands of years hunting caribou and buffalo and building their lives in Western Canada, to the Ojibwe and Cree in Northern Ontario and in Manitoba, who built lives on agricultural as well as on hunting and fishing, ways of life that had continued for thousands of years. These were all taken away. And they were taken away by a series of treaties that were negotiated by Indian Affairs officials, most famous of which was also a Canadian poet who, when I was a kid, we used to read his poetry in public school, Duncan Scott. And the treaties were done like this, and there's now a great book out, by the way, called Treaty 9. Anybody wants to read it, by a guy called John Long. It's a huge book, massive, great book. It came out a couple of years ago. It's a really brilliant account of the Treaty 9. And Treaty 9 is most of northern Ontario. It is a huge expanse of land where Tony Clement told us yesterday we're going to have the biggest economic development since the oil sands. Literally, 3 commissioners who there already had been negotiations between Ontario and Canada as to how this was going to be done. How are we going to do this? How are we going to cook this up? So they did the deal. And there was a pre-negotiation between Ontario and the federal government and Canada. Then the commissioners, one of whom was named by Ontario, 2 of whom were named by Canada, went north. And they went by train and by canoe. And they spent an entire summer in 1905 canoeing along the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers and turning up at trading posts. And they'd get in and say, we're here to discuss the treaty. They'd have translators with them. And they'd say, here it is. Take it or leave it. This is the treaty. So it wasn't exactly what you or I would call a negotiation. It was a proposition. And the people who were there, some of whom were traditional chiefs, some of whom were just there, were asked to hold the pen of the person who had the pen in his hand, a white guy, and mark a cross or an X, depending on your perspective as to what it really was. And that is what we call Treaty Number 9. Now, under Treaty Number 9, and under all the numbered treaties that go right across Western Canada, the words of the treaty say that in exchange for $5 a year and an ability to hunt and fish and a piece of reserve land, the people who signed their cross surrendered all the land. They gave it up. In an hour-long meeting that may not even have gone that long. Now, I think, we talk about, and what's fascinating is that the narrative of the two groups who were signing were completely different. The oral history of the Cree and Ojibwe, which has now been presented in court and over the last 30, 40 years is being widely litigated, the oral history tells us that the people who were there believed that they were saying, thank you, we need your protection, we're in risk of starving, conditions are getting more difficult, yes, we're prepared to share the land, and we appreciate the housing and other things that we've been given, thank you. And, of course, the lawyers working hard for the government of Ontario and hard for the government of Canada said, we've got it. We've got the surrender of title. We've got what we need. And we can go ahead. Now, what is troublesome to me today is that there are still lawyers for the federal government and lawyers for the Crown in Ontario who believe that the Crown now controls that land. Whereas, as far as the First Nations are concerned, no, it is not your land. It is not anyone's land. It is land that is there to be shared, in which the First Nations people believe strongly and intensely that they have a right to share it. So we've gone through the treaty process, which one could argue was hardly an exercise in the fair, and it wasn't exactly the Treaty of Versailles, okay? It's not exactly a long discussion in which people are bargaining and talking and finally coming up with an agreement. It's simply a document that is imposed on people, none of whom would have had any command of written English, and all of whom would have had to have something translated and told to them, what exactly am I signing? So under any legal test today, you'd say, well, you bought this vacuum cleaner from a traveling salesman, and, under the Consumer Protection Act, you'd say, this doesn't meet the test. but it is the basis for all of public policy that has followed since. We then went into the exercise where people said, well, in order to civilize people, we're going to have to take you away from your homes. We're going to have to put your kids in a residential school. And we're going to make it wrong for them to speak their own language and to practice their own culture. And then in 10 or 15 years, you can have them back again. And it's taken us 100 years as a country, literally 100 years, to come to terms with the psychological and sociological and very, very human tragedies that this has caused. Not to speak of the abuse that in some instances obviously happened, not to speak of of all of that side of what went wrong, but just the very premise that you're taking people out of their homes and out of their situation and attempting to, as the words were at the time, to take the Indian out of the child. We did this as Canadians. Our governments did this. Our Prime Minister, to give him credit, apologized for it. But the challenge for public policy today is that what follows the apology? We understand that the residential school exercise was a disaster, but what follows it? So what have we tried? Well, we've tried the white paper in 1968, 67, 68, 68, 69. Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Chrétien together, and I believe that it was a well-intentioned effort to say, look, none of this colonial stuff is working. The federal government is going to pull away from its paternal role. We're going to get rid of the Indian Act. We're going to get rid of all of the role of the federal government, and we're going to treat everybody equally, and everyone's free to go wherever you want to go. Live how you want to live under the provincial jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction. How do you want to go? It's up to you. And it was rejected wholeheartedly by the Aboriginal population because they said to Mr. Trudeau, you may believe in individual rights, but you don't understand the collective rights that we have. And to be fair to Mr. Trudeau, he got the message. And in 1969, 1970, Mr. Trudeau said, I hear you. You don't want this. Okay? Let's try and figure out what else is going to work. And in a sense, that's what we've been doing ever since then, trying to figure out what will work and how it will work. The courts have played an extraordinary role in reviving the importance of the Royal Proclamation, in saying we've got to go beyond the written words of the treaties to understand the oral context in which the treaties were drafted. We've got to recognize the importance of self-government. And if it wasn't for the courts, and for the Supreme Court of Canada in particular, and the jurisprudence of the last 25 years, we wouldn't be anywhere near as far along, thank goodness, as we actually are. When patriation happened in 1980, 79, 80, 81, the First Nations insisted that their treaty rights and other Aboriginal rights had to be protected in the Constitution, and they were in Section 35. We then had the reaction to Meech, where the First Nations said, and Elijah Harper held his feather up and said, if our rights are not further protected, then no one else's rights are going anywhere. And so Meech went down. So we tried at Charlottetown, I say we because that's the one process that I was involved in personally, we tried to bring it back, and we did in the negotiations, and we did in the actual wording of the agreement get the right to self-government, the inherent right to self-government, and a process for dealing with self-government into the agreement, and it was defeated. Prime Minister sets up the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which remains today the locus classicus, as great Royal Commissions always do. All students of Canadian public policy know that every once in a while a Royal Commission comes along which is actually able to commission a lot of work, get a lot of historical work done, point the analysis, and point the way as to where we should go. Unfortunately, it was stillborn. They did all the work. Pointed out the need for a new proclamation, pointed out the need for new treaties, pointed out the need for self-government, pointed out the demographic reality which we were facing then, which is that a majority in a number of Western cities is going to be made up of First Nations people over the next 20 years, which is that the demographic boom that's going on in the Aboriginal population is completely transforming the nature of the country itself. We have two huge migrations going on in Canada today. The first one is the migration that we have of people coming into Canada from outside. But the second great migration that is happening in Canada, unnoticed, unobserved by many central Canadian observers and thinkers, is the move off reserve into cities. The towns of Northern Ontario, the communities of the North, communities of Western Canada, even, dare I say it, Toronto, Montreal, and yes, Kingston, with growing Aboriginal populations, which are not going to get any smaller. Because compare for a moment the life that a kid on reserve would have lived 50 or 60 years ago with the life that a kid on reserve is living today. There would have been no radio, there would have been no television. I'm talking of the remote communities in the North. There would have been nothing. Where there are now 45,000 people living, by the way, across Northern Ontario. There would have been none of that. So they would have been able to live in a relatively isolated situation where culture and situation would have been relatively controlled. They would have gone out with their parents and their grandparents on hunts. They would have observed all of the religious activity that was taking place. They would have participated in all of the communal and tribal life that was underway. Kid today has got a television with a satellite on the house. The conditions in the house would be just as bad today as they were 50 years ago. You'd still have probably more than one or two families living in 2 or 3 rooms with the wind blowing right through it, and it's minus 30 degrees outside in Attawapiskat in the middle of February. But the kid is going to be watching television and watching whatever it is that's on, 398 channels. And they're going to have a computer in the house, and they're going to be playing computer games, and they're going to be going to school, and they're going to be with their kids, and the first thing that they say to their fellow students is, what the hell is going on? What is the world in which we live? How do we compare our lives, what we face, our situation here, to what's going on outside? It's absolutely bewildering. Completely bewildering. And in that bewilderment, people all too often fall into terrible despair and terrible patterns of bad health and bad ways of thinking. So we have in Canada, we can say, well, we have the highest rates of suicide in our First Nations community. In the Inuit community of Canada, we have the highest rates of suicide anywhere in the world. And I hate to disagree with our Prime Minister, but I will. We need to know the root causes of that. We really need to know the causes of that, and then we need to do something about the causes. Because don't tell me that it's inevitable, don't tell me that it's natural, and don't tell me that there's nothing we can do about it. That can't be the case. So we've had several steps wrong. And it's very easy to say what's wrong. It's a lot harder to say what's right and what works. But there are some things we know. We know, for example, that, and this is, for me, one of the great ironies as an Ontarian, is that we, in Quebec and British Columbia, they didn't sign the treaties that were signed in the 19th century. They didn't even sign the treaties that were signed by the Crown in the 18th century, as they did in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They had no treaties. So they've had to negotiate treaties now. So who's the best off in the country? The best off in the country are the James Bay Cree. Compare the wealth of the James Bay Cree and the wealth of the James Bay Cree just on the other side of James Bay, on the Ontario side. Compare the Aboriginal businesses, the Aboriginal entrepreneurship, the success that's been made with those on the East Coast in Quebec, with those on the West Coast in Ontario. It's entirely a product. Not this group are incredibly active, and this group they just don't have the wherewithal. No, it's money. It's about who got the resources, who got the incredible benefits of the financial settlements that were reached in the 1980s, and they were negotiated in a year. The James Bay Agreement took a year to negotiate. Why? Because, if I might borrow the words of the Royal Proclamation, it's the right thing to do, but it's also in our interests, said the Quebec government. It is in our interest to do this real fast. We want to develop hydro. We can't afford litigation that's going to take another 25 years. We can't afford to deal with the claims, so we're going to have agreements. So the agreement said, well, some land is settled for reserve, some land is broadly there for fishing and hunting, and some land is there for development, but the benefits of development will be shared. The first government to have done so. In British Columbia, where, again, no treaties, no recognition of rights. In fact, if you go back to the 19th century, the declarations of the British Columbia government were we're never going to sign anything with these people. They deserve nothing. Less than nothing is what they're going to get from us. Well, two things happened. One was the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, in the Calder case, they said, you know what? Terra nullius is nonsense. There were people here. And there is something called Aboriginal title. That had a real impact on Mr. Trudeau. I think the historical record will say, you know, there's something going on here that's different from the classic European view of individual rights. I'm beginning to get the message. A big moment in Canadian history. But it had a big impact on the Nisga'a and it had a big impact on the federal government. And the second thing that happened, and it happened relatively recently, was that a British Columbia premier did a 180. Premier Campbell did something which was, I think, one of the most dramatic things that's happened in our history as a country on this issue. He basically turned around and said, you know, I've been thinking a whole lot about this question. And I've been saying what every premier of this province has said for a long, long time, and that is we're not going to negotiate, we're not going to give away land, we're not going to cede our sovereignty, we're not going to yield, we're not going to give way. And he said, I was wrong, and actually we have to give way. And you know what made him give way? Was because he realized that there will never be certainty with respect to economic development unless there is a clear understanding between the First Nations and everyone else. And unless we accede to that request for certainty, we're not going to have the kind of economic development which we need. So I want to conclude. And I know I say this just to give you a sense of relief as you sit with such quiet. I've said before that the locus classicus is the Royal Commission, and I don't agree with every recommendation of the Commission, and I think that parts of it, time has passed and there's new things we have to do. But I do think that there's a page in the introduction of the Commission which says this, and as all of us as students of public policy should just listen to this. Aboriginal people's living standards have improved in the last 50 years, but they do not come close to those of non-Aboriginal people. Life expectancy is lower. 20 years later, it's still true. Illness is more common. Still true. Human problems from family violence to alcohol abuse are more common too. Still true. Fewer children graduate from high school. Still true, although more graduate now than graduated 20 years ago. The homes of Aboriginal people are more often flimsy, leaky, and overcrowded. Very true. Water and sanitation systems are more often inadequate. Still true. Fewer Aboriginal people have jobs. Still true. More spend time in jails and prisons. More true. 85% of the prison population in the province of Saskatchewan is made up of Aboriginal people. It's extraordinary what's happened. Even among women, the rates are going through the roof. The Commission goes on to say this, and I still think this is very true. Aboriginal people do not want pity or handouts. They want recognition that these problems are largely the result of loss of their lands and resources, destruction of their economies and social institutions, and denial of their nationhood. They seek a range of remedies for these injustices, but most of all, they seek control of their lives. I believe that's still the case. I also think there's something else that needs to be said. And now I'm going to sound quite strange, but the master and slave relationship, as a philosopher once pointed out, has a terrible impact on the master as much as it has an impact on the slave. Yes, it's a corruption of the slave. It's a corruption of the slave because of the conditions under which the slave is living. But we should not forget the corruption of the master, that it makes those who are in charge less than complete, because it forces them to act in ways that are, in the end, less than fully human. I believe very strongly that there is a profound spiritual element in the need in this country for the circle of life to become whole again. Just yesterday morning, I was visiting the Wabano Aboriginal Health Center in Ottawa, which, by the way, is the only Aboriginal health center of its size and kind in the whole of the country, which, when you think about it, is kind of incredible. But in the middle of this center, which is a beautiful rebuilt place designed by Douglas Cardinal, it's a very beautiful institution, there's a healing lodge, which is, as you know, a circle. And what's quite extraordinary is that when you go in there, and I was in there yesterday with the people who were taking me and Senator Eggleton around the center, and you sit, suddenly there's a sense of peace, and you're looking at the other person, and you can't not look at them. You can't look away. You can't not see them, not see their eyes, and not look at them and deal with their situation directly. There is such a thing as a circle of life. And what we have to realize is that John Ralston Saul says Canada is a Métis nation. I wish that were true, but I don't really think actually it's exactly describes the situation. I think I know that what he was trying to say is, I wish we were. But actually we're not. Because we're not yet a nation that fully appreciates and understands all of the elements that make up who we are. And it's very difficult for a settler country where 95% or 97% of the population is non-Aboriginal to say, how are we going to deal with the fact that we have the original Canadians are still living on the margins of our own country. Yes, we see more great symbols of Aboriginal art in our museums. We recognize the beauty of what is there. Hardly any of us would recognize a Cree or Ojibwe word. Many of us would feel probably that we could spend our entire lives without ever really having to encounter the reality of life for 1 million of our fellow citizens. But we have to ask ourselves, when we see the pictures on our television screens, and when we realize the conditions under which people are living, we have to ask ourselves, is this really the best that we can do? Can I feel really whole as a Canadian unless I have come to terms with this part of our history and this part of who we have been and who we will be? Half the Aboriginal population of the country is under the age of 25. It's the exact opposite of the demographics of the increasingly white-haired population that we see around us. And so we have to come to terms with this as a country. Who's going to do the jobs in the north? Who's going to become the people who will take control of our resources? We talk about how this is going to be the great potential of our country in the future. Who's going to do something about it? Do we really want to live our future in Western cities and in all of our communities faced with crime and violence and the threat of life breaking down? Do we really want to live in cities where there are whole parts of the city and neighborhoods where we can't go? Is this the kind of country we want to build? I don't think so. Certainly not the kind of country I want to build or I want to see us build as Canadians. So for me, it is, if I may say so, not only the right thing to do, it's also in our interest to do it. And so my pitch to the majority is, it's not about only making you feel better, although I do think that's important. But it is about recognizing that this is something that's in the interest of our country to deal with. And I also know in my heart of hearts that it won't happen without leadership. I know I've seen too many situations in government and out of government where things will just drift along. Things will kind of just go. We don't have the money for it this year. We can't make it happen now. It'll have to wait for another time. I'll let the next guy worry about it. We can't go on like this. We missed the boat at Charlottetown. I say that as somebody who was there. I think we really missed the boat. We missed the boat at Kelowna, where Mr. Martin took the leadership role and said, we're going to do this, and it's going to cost us money, but we're going to make the investments. We're going to start to make it happen. And that was the first thing that Mr. Harper tore up when he became the Prime Minister. But never give up. We've still got work to do. There's still an agenda there that needs to get done, that needs to be addressed, and it's time for us to do it. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate it very much.